She was 21 and had just been thrown out. Not eased along, not given a week, thrown on an empty stomach into a Texas summer with nothing in her hands. And with $10, the last money she owned, she bought an abandoned chuckwagon standing in the weeds behind a livery barn in a played-out trail town on the Red River. A wagon nobody had hitched a team to in 18 years. The canvas bows were bare. The wheels had shrunk in their tires. The liveryman who took her money told her the trail drives were finished and gone, that the wagon was firewood on wheels, and that a hungry girl who spent her last $10 on a dead cook's rig had bought herself nothing but a place to sit down and starve. But what nobody knew, not the liveryman, not the town, not the girl herself, was that under the bed of that old wagon, sealed since 1874, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Selma Rourke knew what real hunger did to a person, and it was the thing she understood better than anyone she ever met. She was born in 1873 in the Red River country of North Texas, the fourth of 7 children of a tenant farmer, and she grew up in the particular kind of poverty where there is food, but never enough of it, and where a child learns before she learns her letters that you eat fast and you do not ask for more. Her mother fed 9 people out of a cast iron pot for 20 years, and Selma was at her elbow from the time she could stand, learning the whole arithmetic of feeding the poor. How to stretch a piece of salt pork across a week, how to make cornbread that would sit in a person and last, how to build a fire that would cook and not waste, how to make a thin thing taste like a full one. It was not cooking the way rich people meant it. It was engineering, done with almost nothing, 3 times a day forever, and she was good at it. That was the strange thing about a life like hers, that the one talent she had was for a job nobody paid for. By 15, she was the one who cooked for the family, and she was better at it than her mother, and when the harvest crews came through, she cooked for them too, and the crews began asking for that place by name. She used to think, standing over the pot with her arms aching, that if she had been born a man, she would have been a cook for an outfit somewhere and been paid actual money. But she was a girl in a tenant farmer's house, and so what she had was a talent that everyone ate and no one saw. Then, in the winter of 1893, the cotton failed, and the landlord took the place, the way landlords did, and the family broke apart the way families did. Her father went to his brother in Arkansas with the 2 youngest. The older boys went for wages, and Selma, 21, went to a cousin's house in the town of Cutter's Bend, where she cooked and cleaned for her keep for 8 months and understood the whole time that she was on trial. She failed the trial in the ordinary way. The cousin's husband lost his job at the gin, and money went short, and a big eating girl who was not their own child became the obvious economy. There was an argument about a missing dollar that Selma had not taken. There was a week of cold silence. And then on a hot morning in August, the cousin told her that they could not go on, and Selma asked where she was to go, and the cousin said she was sure a girl of 21 would manage, and shut the door on her with her carpetbag on the step and 11 cents to her name. She did not eat for 2 days. That is the part of this story people skip past, and it is the part that matters, because it is the reason for everything she did afterward. 2 days is not starving to death. 2 days is nothing, and she knew even then that it was nothing. But it taught her a thing she had not known despite a lifetime of being poor, which is what hunger does to your mind, how it narrows everything down, how it makes you stupid and frightened and ashamed, how by the second afternoon she could not have told you her own plans because there was no room in her head for anything but the thought of food. She sat on a bench outside the depot at Cutter's Bend and understood that people walking past her had no idea, and that she had had no idea either, 3 days earlier. The shame was the part that surprised her. She had expected the hollowness and the headache and the shakiness in the hands. She had been poor her whole life and had gone to bed light more times than she could count. What she had not expected was that being genuinely hungry in public would make her feel like a criminal. She caught herself arranging her face so that nobody would guess. She walked past a bakery on the second morning and had to keep walking, and she was more embarrassed than anything else. Embarrassed at wanting it so badly, as though wanting to eat were a thing a decent person would have had better manners than to do. A woman came out of the hotel kitchen and threw a pan of scraps to a dog in the alley, and Selma stood in the road and looked at it, and then went away, and she thought about that pan of scraps for the rest of her life. She never told anyone about those 2 days. Not the cousin, not the hotel people, not for 30 years. It was the single most formative experience she ever had, and she buried it, and the reason she buried it is exactly the reason she later built her whole life around it. Because a hungry person is ashamed, and a person who is ashamed does not ask, and a person who does not ask goes on being hungry. She got work on the third day, scrubbing at the hotel for meals and a place in the back. And within a month, she had $10 saved, and the $10 was the point. It was going to be a train ticket. She had it worked out. And then, she walked past the livery barn. The Chuckwagon was standing in the weeds behind it where it had stood for 18 years, and Selma Rourke stopped in the road and looked at it the way you look at a thing you recognize. She knew what it was. Everybody in that country knew what a chuckwagon was. Though the drives were finished by then and the wagons were mostly gone, the mobile kitchen of a trail outfit, the wagon that fed 12 men 3 times a day for 3 months up the trail to Kansas. This one was in bad shape, but it was all there. The box body, the bare bows where the canvas had rotted off, the water barrel bracket on the side. The wide iron tires shrunk loose on the wheels, and at the back, the thing that made it what it was, the chuck box, the tall cabinet built onto the tailgate, with its hinged lid that dropped down on a leg to make a work table, and behind the lid the little grid of drawers and cubbies where a cook kept everything he owned. She stood there a long time. What she was doing, standing in that road, was not planning. It was something closer to recognition. She had never in her life owned a pot she had not been handed. Every kitchen she had ever worked in belonged to somebody else. Her mother's, the cousins, the hotel's, and every meal she had ever cooked had been cooked on sufferance, in another person's house, with another person's flour, for which she was expected to be grateful. She had a talent that had never once been hers. And here was a kitchen with wheels on it, standing in the weeds, belonging to nobody. She walked around it twice. She put her hand on the wheel and found the fellow's sound under the shrunk tire. She dropped the chuck box lid on its leg, and the hinges shrieked. And the little grid of cubbies looked out at her, and she stood there with her hand flat on that work table, a work table built at exactly the right height, by a wagon maker, for a person to stand at all day and cook, and something in her chest went so tight she had to step back from it. She went into the barn and asked the liveryman, a heavy, unhurried man named Doyle Frett, what he wanted for it. He laughed at her, not cruelly, and said she could have it for $10 and haul it off, and that she'd be doing him a favor since he'd been meaning to break it up for firewood for a decade. It had belonged, he said, to an outfit that folded in the 70s, and the cook who'd run it had died, and it had been standing there ever since because nobody wanted a chuckwagon in a country with no cattle drives left in it. He told her plainly that it was firewood on wheels and that she should keep her money. Selma Rourke handed him $10. She could not have explained it that day, and she got better at explaining it later, and what she said, when she was old and people asked, was this. She had spent 2 days that August not eating, and she had spent her whole life feeding people for nothing. And there in the weeds was a kitchen. A whole kitchen. On wheels. For $10. She did not know what she was going to do with it. She knew that she had one skill in this world, and here was the only tool that skill had ever needed, going for the price of a train ticket to somewhere she had no reason to go. She cleaned it out over 3 days, and that is when she found it. And she found it because she was thorough in the way poor people are thorough. She was not exploring. She was salvaging, going over every inch of that wagon for anything she could use or sell. The chuck box was empty except for mouse ruin. The wagon bed was empty. But when she got down underneath to look at the running gear, she found that the wagon had a false floor. She knew it at once. Because she had grown up around wagons and because the arithmetic was wrong, the bed's inside floor sat a good 4 inches higher than the frame it rested on, and there was nothing that gap could be for. A cook's wagon carried weight, flour, beans, coffee, a water barrel, 100 pounds of Dutch ovens, and no wagon maker in Texas would waste 4 inches of load depth on nothing. She got a bar and worked at the boards from underneath, and a section of the false floor came away in her hands, and out of the gap between the false floor and the true one, into the dirt at her knees, slid a flat tin box, a canvas-wrapped bundle, and a folded letter that had been lying in the dark of that wagon for 18 years. The letter had one line on the outside, in a careful, laboring, self-taught hand, for whoever gets my wagon. Selma Rourke sat down in the weeds behind the livery barn and read it. "I do not write easy, so I will keep this short," it began. "My name is Zebedee Pace, and I cooked for the Hollis outfit and 2 others before it for 31 years, from the year after the war until now, and this wagon has been my whole life and my only home. If you are reading this, then I am dead, and somebody has finally pulled up the floor. I want to tell you 3 things. The first is what is in the tin. That is my wages. 31 years of them, near enough. A trail cook is paid better than the hands. Most folks do not know that, but he is, because a bad cook loses you an outfit and a good one holds it together, and I had nothing to spend it on out there, and so it added up. It is more than you would think. I kept it in the wagon, because for most of those years there was not a bank in this part of Texas that would take a colored man's money and hold it honest, and the one time I tried it I got cheated, and after that I trusted the floor of my own wagon more than I trusted any man with a window and a ledger. There is nobody to leave it to. I never married, and I have no people living that I know of. So it is yours, whoever you are, and I hope it does you good. The second thing is the book. The canvas bundle was a book, a thick, swollen, grease-stained, string-tied book, its pages a mix of ruled paper and flour sack paper and the backs of tally sheets, and it was 31 years of a trail cook's working knowledge written down by a man who had taught himself to write in order to do it. "That is everything I know," he wrote. "How to feed 12 men 3 times a day for 90 days out of a wagon. What keeps and what does not. How to cook in a wind and how to cook in the rain, and how to get a fire going with wet wood, and how to make coffee that will get a man onto a horse at 4 in the morning. How to stretch a barrel of flour 11 days past when it should have run out. What to do for a man with a broke arm or a snake bite or the misery, because the cook is the doctor too. How much a man can eat and still ride, and how much is too much. I have wrote down everything because I did not want it to go in the ground with me. The third thing is what I am asking, and you do not have to do it. I had one rule at this wagon, and I kept it for 31 years, he wrote. Nobody goes hungry at my fire. Not the hands, that is the job. I mean anybody. Drifters come in off the trail. Indians come to the wagon, and I fed them, and I took some grief for it, and I did not care. Men on the run from something. A boy of about 14 once who had been 3 days walking. Rustlers, twice, that I knew were rustlers. I fed all of them, and I never once asked a man his business before I handed him a plate, because I have been hungry. And there is not any argument you can make to a hungry man that is louder than food, and a man who has eaten will listen to you when a man who has not eaten will not. That is all I did with my life, and I would do it the same. So if you have got my wagon, and if you can cook, or want to learn out of that book, then I would take it kindly if you kept a fire under it and fed whoever comes. And if you cannot, then take the money and go do something else, and I am glad it went to somebody instead of rotting in the floor. Z. Pace. His own hand, which took me 11 years to learn. Selma Rourke read that letter 3 times sitting in the weeds, and the third time she read it, she was crying so hard she had to stop and start over, because she had been 2 days without food 4 weeks earlier, and there was a dead man telling her that there is not any argument you can make to a hungry man that is louder than food. The tin was heavier than it looked. 31 years of a trail cook's wages, in gold and silver, saved by a man with nowhere to spend it and nobody to leave it to. It was, Selma would say later, more money than she had believed existed in one place, and it was not what she was crying about. She spent the first month just reading the book. It took her that long because Zebedee Pace had not written it for a stranger. He had written it for himself, in his own shorthand, with his own spellings, and half of it assumed you already knew what a Dutch oven and a firehook and a possum belly were. But Selma Rourke had been feeding 9 people out of one pot since she was 8 years old, and she came to that book already knowing 3/4 of what it was about, and the last quarter was the part she had never had. The quantities. Scale. How to do what she already did, but for 40 people instead of 9, in the open, in the weather, from a wagon. And there was something else in it that she did not expect, which was the man. He had not meant to put himself in there. It was a working book, all measures and methods. But you cannot write down 31 years of anything without leaking, and he leaked all through it. There was a line about how a cook should keep the coffee going all night on a bad drive, because men who cannot sleep will come and sit, and that is when they will tell you what is wrong. There was a note in the middle of a page about biscuit dough that said, "Do not let a hand eat standing up alone off to one side, go set by him." There was a passage about a boy who had come in off the trail and eaten 4 plates and cried, with no further explanation, as though the writer had needed to put it down somewhere and this was the only paper he had. Selma read that book the way other people read scripture. She learned it, and then she carried it, and by the time she was 50, she could have written it out from memory. And she said more than once that she had been raised by 2 people, her mother, who taught her to cook, and a man dead 18 years before she ever touched his wagon, who taught her what it was for. She rebuilt the wagon over that winter with the dead man's money, and she did it right. New tires shrunk on by a smith, new bows, new canvas, the chuck box repaired and refitted, a water barrel, Dutch ovens, a coffee mill, the whole outfit. It cost a great deal, and she did not care, and old Doyle Frett at the livery, who had told her it was firewood on wheels, watched the thing come back to life in his own yard over 4 months and got quiet about it. She was careful about one thing, and it mattered to her more than anyone understood at the time. She changed nothing that Zebedee Pace had built. She replaced what had rotted and repaired what had broken, and she did not improve a single thing. The chuck box stayed exactly as he had laid it out, every drawer where he had put it, the coffee cubby on the left where a right-handed man would want it at 4 in the morning, the spice drawers in the order he had chosen for reasons she did not yet understand and later did. There is a way to lay out a kitchen that only comes from 31 years of standing in it, and Selma Rourke had the sense to recognize that she was holding one and to leave it alone. The smith who shrunk the tires told her she was throwing good money at a dead trade and asked her, reasonably enough, what she meant to haul in it. She said she did not know yet. He said that was a hell of a thing to spend that much money on. She said it was, and paid him. She did not know, that first winter, what exactly she was building it for. There were no trail drives left, but she knew that she had a kitchen on wheels and a book that told her how to use it, and she had a feeling that the country was going to tell her what to do with it, and it did. It told her the next summer, in 1895, when the drought came. That was the year the Red River country burned up and the tenant families started moving, the same thing that had happened to her own family 2 years before. Happening now to everybody at once, all along the river bottoms. People on the road with wagons and children, and no money, and no destination. And Selma Rourke hitched a team to Zebedee Pace's wagon and drove out to the crossing at Cutter's Bend, where the families were camped waiting to ford, and she built a fire and put on the big ovens and started cooking. and when the first man came over to ask what she was charging, she said nothing and handed him a plate. She fed 110 people that first day. She had worked it out of the book, the quantities, the timing, how to hold a fire for 8 hours, how to feed a crowd out of a wagon designed for 12, and it was Zebedee Pace's arithmetic that made it possible. 31 years of trail knowledge applied to a thing he had never imagined. She learned more in those 11 weeks than in the 21 years before them. She learned that the hardest part was not the cooking, it was the ordering. That you cannot feed 110 people by making 110 decisions. You feed them by making 4 decisions correctly at 4 in the morning, and then not deviating. She learned that beans want more time than anybody thinks, and that a fire will lie to you about how hot it is. She learned to bake bread in the ground. And she learned the thing about people, which the book had not told her, and which she came to think was the real education of her life, that almost nobody came to the wagon the first day. They watched it from their camps. Whole families sat 200 yards off, plainly hungry, and did not come. And she could not understand it until she remembered the bakery window and the pan of scraps and the way she had arranged her own face on that bench at the depot. They were ashamed. Of course, they were ashamed. So she changed how she did it. She stopped standing behind the wagon waiting to be approached and started walking out with plates. And she stopped saying anything that sounded like an offer of charity and started saying that she had cooked too much and it would spoil. Which was a lie, and everybody knew it was a lie, and it worked, because it gave a man a way to take a plate without having asked for it. That was Selma Rourke's whole method for 51 years. And she invented it in about 4 days out of nothing but her own memory of being too ashamed to want food. It went on for 11 weeks that summer. Then it stopped raining again in 1897, and she went out again. And somewhere in there it stopped being a thing she did in emergencies and became the thing she did. She was not a charity, and she never called it one, and she had rules, and the rules were Zebedee Pace's. She never asked anybody their business. She never asked why they were on the road. She did not preach at them, and she did not make them wait for a sermon or sign anything or give a name, because she had sat on a bench outside a depot with 11 cents and she knew exactly how much shame a hungry person is already carrying, and she would not add to it. You came to the wagon. You got a plate, and if you wanted to talk you could, and if you did not, you could eat and go. She took grief for it, the same grief Pace had taken. There were people in every county who thought she was encouraging idleness, and there were a few over the years who told her so directly, standing at her fire while she cooked. She had a stock answer that she used for 50 years, delivered without heat and without stopping what she was doing. And it was this, that she had never in her life met a man who was hungry on purpose, and that if they knew of one they should send him to her, because she would like to meet him. Nobody ever sent her one. There were harder days than that. She was robbed twice. She lost the second team to a bad winter. She had a run of about 3 years in her 40s when she was worn thin enough that she thought about stopping, and she told a friend once that the only reason she did not was that the wagon did not belong to her, that she was holding it for a man who had held it for 31 years, and that quitting felt less like giving up than like breaking a promise to somebody she had never met. She worked out of that wagon for 51 years. Where the money came from is a question people asked her all her life, and the answer was, the wagon paid its own way. Mostly, she cooked for money when there was money to be had. For threshing crews and fencing outfits and roundups, and later for road gangs and railroad section crews, and later still for oil field camps. And she was famous in 3 counties for being the best camp cook in North Texas, which she was. And the money she made feeding men who could pay, she spent feeding people who could not. She kept Zebedee Pace's tin, and it never ran out, because she never lived on it. She lived on her own cooking, and the tin was for flour. An old trail boss named Gideon Locke found her out at a camp in about 1899 and stood looking at the wagon for a while, and then asked her, carefully, where she had gotten it. She told him. And Gideon Locke, who was 70 and had brought 11 herds up the trail, sat down on the tailgate of that chuck box and told her about Zebedee Pace. That he was the best trail cook that ever worked that country, that outfits fought over him, that men would sign on to a drive because of who was cooking. And then he told her the things she had already read in the letter and had not fully believed, that Pace fed everybody who came in, and that it caused talk, and that Pace never once stopped. Gideon Locke came to the wagon every few weeks for the last 6 years of his life, and Selma always said that he was the only person alive who could tell her whether she was doing it right. She was in her 50s when a newspaper in Fort Worth found out about her, and she gave them about 4 sentences and would not be photographed, which she regretted later only because it meant there is exactly one picture of her, standing at the tailgate with her sleeves rolled, not looking at the camera. She was in her 70s in the worst years of the 30s, and that was when the wagon did the most work it ever did, and by then there were 2 of them, because she had trained a younger woman and built a second rig off the same book. She died at 81, and the funeral was in a field because no church in that county was big enough, and people came from 4 states, and a great many of them were people nobody there could identify. Doyle Frett, the liveryman who had told her she'd bought a place to sit down and starve, lived long enough to see what it became, and it is recorded that in his last years he would tell anybody who would listen, with the particular pride of a man claiming credit for something he tried to talk somebody out of, that he was the one who sold Selma Rourke that wagon. If you go to Cutter's Bend today, and there is still a town there, small, on the Red River, the wagon is under a roof at the County Museum, restored, with its chuckbox lid down on its leg, the way a cook would have it. The false floor is open, and the tin box is in it, and the boards are propped so you can see the gap where a man kept 31 years of wages because no bank in that county would hold them honestly. Zebedee Pace's book is in a case, open, its pages grease-stained and swollen, and beside it his letter in a laboring self-taught hand, and a card that says he learned to write at the age of 32 for the sole purpose of setting down what he knew about feeding people so it would not go into the ground with him. And painted along the side of the wagon box, in letters Selma Rourke had put there herself in 1895 and had repainted every few years for 51 years, is the only rule the thing ever had: nobody goes hungry at this fire. There is a kind of inheritance that has nothing to do with land or blood, and everything to do with a rule somebody kept. It waits under the floors of the world's discarded things, not for the one who wants a fortune, but for the one who has been hungry and has not forgotten it, because they are the only ones who will understand what the rule is for. The world had told Selma Rourke she was worthless, the same way it had told that wagon it was firewood, with a shut door and a low price and a shrug. It only ever takes one person who remembers being hungry to prove the world's cold arithmetic wrong. Selma Rourke was 21 years old and thrown out. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned chuckwagon standing in the weeds behind a livery barn in a played-out trail town on the Red River. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, has a stranger ever fed you when you needed it? And did you ever get to thank them? We'd love to hear your story. See you in the next one.